All right, full house and a stormy evening. So we really appreciate everybody coming out here to be with us tonight. So as you know, we're here for the conversation, A Weapon of the West, a Weapon Against the West, Anti-Semitism and its Anti-American Objectives. We are really thrilled to have you here. We're very grateful also to our speakers and panelists for doing this event. And I also want to specifically thank one of our Vandenberg Advisory Board members, John Mark. Where are you, John Mark? Over in the back, for helping us secure this location. So the timing for an event like this is not coincidental. As many of you know, last week was the 30th anniversary of the EMEA bombing, a date on which over 85 people were killed and 300 injured by a Hezbollah and Iranian-led terrorist attack in Buenos Aires. Until October 7th, actually, this bombing was the largest slaughter of Jews in a single day since the Holocaust. Now, in the 30 years since that attack, we had hoped that bigotries like anti-Semitism were slowly being eradicated. Unfortunately, that is not the case. Over the last few months, all of us have been watching with horror as our campuses have emerged with one of the world's oldest hatreds, anti-Semitism. In the immediate aftermath of October 7th, itself an attack against Jews, the Anti-Defamation League reported a 360% increase in anti-Semitic attacks inside the United States. We have seen how violent messages mentioning Jews and Israel on platforms like Telegram increased by a factor of 10 in the same period. Much of these incidents are occurring on college campuses, where in addition to accusations against Israel, we all too often hear chants of death to America and see images of burning American flags. Protesters have donned the garb of known terrorist organizations and even gone so far as to justify the terrorist attack of September 11th as resistance. But what's happening doesn't stop at our borders. Our adversaries like Russia, Iran, and China have long had a legacy of promoting anti-Semitism towards their own ends. Indeed, many modern-day anti-Semitic tropes originated in the 19th century Tsarist production of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Today, these same adversaries are deeply committed to undermining the US and reorienting world power towards their own ambitions. So that really got us thinking and led to this event today, which is, what is the connection between anti-Semitism and anti-Americanism? And how are our adversaries, who are ever set on countering US influence, exploiting the Israel-Hamas war to spread anti-American propaganda? How does anti-Semitism serve as what has been called the canary in the coal mine for the cultural rot of a society? And how do we inoculate ourselves and, importantly, our college students against this foreign-inspired hatred? So our experts will dive into these questions and more, ultimately highlighting that the toxic spread of anti-Semitism is part of a much larger effort, spurred on by our adversaries to undermine American values, sow distrust among our citizens, and ultimately chip away at the very foundation of the United States. We'll begin the discussion with some remarks by Ludo Hood, who has been serving the U.S. Department of State as a senior advisor to the Special Envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism. He has served in this position since May of 2021. He's a career Foreign Service officer with 2 decades of experience working in Middle East affairs. He'll give us a lay of the land on the surge of anti-Semitism we're experiencing both here and abroad, and then I'll invite in our panel for a broader discussion, including a Q&A. So please join me in welcoming Senior Advisor Ludovic Hood.
Good afternoon. Unlike my co-speakers, I have to stand here and try and keep you interested and excited for 12 minutes as much as I prefer the Q&A. Only 30 colleagues at the State Department had to review and clear these remarks, but they nonetheless are scintillating in my humble opinion. First of all, obviously, a big thank you to Carrie and her team at the Vandenberg Coalition for convening this event and the panelists, and above all, for homing in on threats and themes about which my colleagues and I have been trying to raise the alarm for many months. Because anti-Semitism is not a niche issue. Anti-Semitism does not solely impact Jews and their institutions, though that is alarming enough. Anti-Semitism, being the canary in the coal mine, may be a hackneyed metaphor, but it's nonetheless true. Not just because what may begin as hatred targeted at Jews often widens to target other groups, but also because, and this goes to the crux of this evening's theme, anti-Semitism is once again being exploited by malign actors, including state actors, looking to sow division and distrust within and among democracies, and that poses a threat to democracy itself. Before I elaborate on this, allow me to say a few words about what we are observing and hearing from our governmental counterparts and Jewish communities around the world. For 2 decades, anti-Semitism had been trending upward, but now we are in the midst of an alarming surge in anti-Semitic incidents, and we are seeing a deeply dismaying normalization of anti-Semitic attitudes and rhetoric in parts of Europe and the Americas and places like Australia. And this surge, of course, began with the October 7th Hamas terrorist attack on Israel and the ensuing war. Within hours of news of the Hamas attack on Israel, while Israeli and American families were still counting their dead, wounded, and kidnapped, there were scenes of people celebrating in jubilation in cities including London, Sydney, and that same Sunday, New York. And as you all know, in the days and weeks that followed October 7th, there was an unprecedentedly sharp rise in anti-Semitic incidents around the world. Can any of you think of any other episode when a ferocious terrorist attack on a country led to widespread demonstrations against the very people who were attacked? What is it about the state of Israel in particular, the world's only country with a majority Jewish population, that attracts such animus and seeming fury? Whatever the answers to those questions, the fact of the matter is that in the months following October 7th, there has been a deeply alarming surge in anti-Semitic incidents. And I'm not talking about anti-Israel incidents, but anti-Jewish incidents. The statistics compiled by governments, law enforcement, community groups, the ADL, and others show that in some European countries, in Canada and Australia, there were more anti-Semitic incidents in the 4 or 8 weeks following October 7th than in all of the prior year. We cannot and must not become inured to the frequent reports of Holocaust memorials, Jewish schools, Jewish-owned businesses, Jewish cemeteries, and synagogues that have been vandalized or attacked in the past 9-10 months or so. Many Jews worldwide have taken to hiding their kippah in public or removing mezuzahs from their doors. It is blatant anti-Semitism when Jews around the world are indiscriminately targeted for attack because their attackers take exception to the policies and practices of the State of Israel. It is classic anti-Semitism to hold all Jews everywhere accountable for Israel's actions. Many Jewish communities around the world report feeling a greater degree of uncertainty and fear than at any time since 1945. Some of this has to do with the protests that now occur routinely in cities around the world, in some cases on a weekly basis. And while, needless to say, there are many people taking to the streets with sincere and understandable motivations for speaking out about the suffering of Palestinians in Gaza, some of the slogans, the chants, and the behavior are deeply offensive and intimidating for most Jewish people. Whether it's the fad of ripping down posters of children kidnapped by Hamas, including American kids, the routine conflation of the State of Israel and all Israelis who are demonized for the policies of their government, whether they agree with their government or not, the not so subtle tropes about who is controlling US foreign policy, the never-ending refrains about Zionists, all too often a dog whistle for expressing disdain for Jews in general, or the commonplace, explicit and veiled expressions of support for Hamas, Hezbollah, and other violent groups, as Kerry mentioned. All this, of course, is deeply alarming to many Jews around the world, and I would venture disturbing to many people outside of those communities. It's common to hear globalize the Intifada during protests. As most of you know, the Intifada is the term used to refer to the multiple periods of lethal attacks on civilians in Israel. Globalizing that Intifada does nothing to aid Palestinian civilians in Gaza or change Israeli policy. Advocacy for pure hatred and violence against Jews, no matter where they live in the world, is reprehensible. It's no accident that law enforcement in some countries bolster security at Jewish sites whenever such protests occur, including warning Jews to stay at home. What does that say about the place of Jews in European and other Western societies? What does it say about where those societies are heading? Again, none of this is to doubt the legitimacy of some criticisms of policies and actions of Israel, or the sincerity of many protesters, particularly young people motivated by what they perceive to be the heartbreaking suffering of Palestinians in Gaza. But at the same time, we need to be clear-eyed about the prejudicial, at best, and deeply alarming and hateful, at worst, aspects of some of the current protests and activism. My office's remit is international. I'll leave it maybe to the other panelists to comment on the controversial and disturbing dynamics that we've seen at demonstrations in the US, including in this town. But let me share two assessments from colleagues in the US Interagency on dynamics relevant to the discussion. 2 weeks ago, Director of National Intelligence Avril Haines issued a statement regarding Iranian influence efforts. I quote, "In recent weeks, Iranian government actors have sought to opportunistically take advantage of ongoing protests regarding the war in Gaza, using a playbook we've seen other actors use over the years. We have observed actors tied to Iran's government posing as activists online, seeking to encourage protests and even providing financial support to protesters." And of course, DNI Haines is talking about the domestic context. And in May, the National Counterterrorism Center, DHS, and FBI issued an unclassified joint intelligence bulletin, which noted in the introduction, "We assess that anti-Semitic beliefs and violent messaging remain a persistent driver of transnational and domestic violent extremist activities across the ideological spectrum and have been exacerbated by the Israel-Hamas conflict. Reactions to Hamas's October 7th attack and ongoing Israeli military actions in the Gaza Strip have prompted violent extremist plots and attacks, primarily from homegrown violent extremists in the United States and individuals abroad. The conflict has also revitalized long-standing anti-Semitic narratives that disparage Jewish communities and incite retaliation against targets perceived as symbolizing a Zionist entity, quote unquote. These events, coupled with the pre-existing anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that permeate violent ideologies, have contributed to a heightened threat environment for Jewish communities globally. Even before October 7th, my colleague, Special Envoy Ambassador Deborah Lipstadt, and our team were increasingly highlighting what we call the multi-layered threat of anti-Semitism. It's imperative that we think of anti-Semitism as more than solely a threat to the welfare of Jews and the Jewish community, although that is reason enough to fight it, but also a threat to democratic governance. Why? Those who believe in the conspiracy myth that Jews somehow control the financial system, control the media, control the government, they see democracy as an illusion. If the Jews control everything, why bother voting, for example? Why bother trying to participate in the democratic process or through institutions to address shortcomings or correct injustices? And also, those who are affected by rising anti-Semitism or mainstreamed anti-Semitism may lose faith in public authorities. If individuals don't feel as though the police or authorities will protect them from hate-fueled attacks, they begin to lose trust in public institutions. The notion that anti-Semitism is confined to the fringes of society is a dangerous fallacy. It doesn't lurk in the shadows. Instead, it influences attitudes and behaviors across all segments of society, from boardrooms to classrooms. When anti-Semitism is tolerated or ignored, it undermines democratic values of tolerance, freedom, diversity, equality. Anti-Semitism has an insidious ability over many centuries to evolve and adapt across different historical periods and cultural landscapes. For example, the concept of blood libel, false claims during the Middle Ages that Jews used the blood of Christian children to bake matzah, is revived in contemporary and ridiculous claims that Israelis harvest the organs of Palestinian children, yet the tropes persist. The constant evolution of anti-Semitic tropes has sustained the unjust vilification and targeting of Jews as some kind of enduring enemy, irrespective of the specific circumstances, perpetuating a cycle of misunderstanding, suspicion, hatred, discrimination, and of course violence, all antithetical to healthy democratic societies. History offers us examples of how anti-Semitism can weaken democratic governance. Although Weimar Germany's collapse in the 1920s cannot be attributed solely to the intensely anti-Semitic campaign of the Nazi Party, There is no doubt that this sustained theme in their campaign helped weaken the German people's trust and faith in democratic rule. As such, identifying anti-Semitism and calling it out is critical precisely because its presence can serve as an early warning sign of democratic backsliding. This means being clear-eyed and honest about manifestations of anti-Semitism, whether they emanate from the right, from the left, or whether they are disguised as criticism or hatred of the State of Israel. The final layer of the multi-level threat, and perhaps one of the more important consequences to understand, is the recognition by malign actors of the power of anti-Semitism to erode trust in public authorities, fan divisions in society, and sow upheaval and even unrest. Often these malign actors believe in anti-Semitism as an ideology, but we are also seeing with increasing frequency the use of utilitarian anti-Semitism. Bad actors who do not necessarily subscribe to anti-Semitism as an ideology, but who wield it as a nefarious means to accomplish their own ends. My colleagues in our office and I are delighted that the Vandenberg Coalition has assembled this evening scholars specializing in China, Iran, and Russia, who can lend their expertise to these themes. All three countries have been on our radar. Iran, needless to say, has a long track record of state-sponsored anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial, exemplified by, for example, the ex-posts of the Supreme Leader, or the complicity of Iran and its proxies in numerous deadly attacks against Jewish communities around the world. Building on disinformation tactics various Kremlins have used for over a century, dating back to Tsarist times, Putin's Russia is manipulating the history of the Holocaust in an attempt to justify its full-scale invasion of Ukraine and to exploit societal tensions in Western Europe. And my office is deeply troubled by the unprecedented proliferation of anti-Semitic content on online platforms controlled by the Chinese government ever since October 7th. This may be a deeply cynical and potentially dangerous geopolitical effort designed to curry favor with countries and publics opposed to Israel's war against Hamas. I'll conclude by restating my appreciation to the Vandenberg Coalition team for convening a much-needed discussion about the broader, dangerous implications of surging anti-Semitism, themes that somehow have been lacking in much of the analysis covering anti-Semitism for the past 9 months. I look forward to your questions later. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Ludo, for those remarks. I'm now excited to introduce our panel, who will dive into these themes a bit more closely. So as was mentioned, each speaker is going to represent more or less a different country and adversary and what they're trying to do to both catalyze and capitalize off of the increased anti-Semitism to undermine America's social cohesion. So on the panel, we're honored to have Ben Taleblu, a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, where he focuses on Iranian security and political issues. He's a native Farsi speaker with deep knowledge of internal Iranian politics. We also have Emily Delabriere, our co-founder at Horizon Advisory and also a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. I guess I'll say they're an informal co-sponsor of this event, which I'm probably not allowed to say, but very good partners to us, and who Emily conducted the first Western analysis to document Beijing's China Standards 2035 National Plan. And Brett Schaefer, a senior fellow on media and digital disinformation at the German Marshall Fund's Alliance for Securing Democracy. He's also the creator and manager of Hamilton 2.0, which I hope we'll talk about, which is an open source database tracking Russian, Chinese, and Iranian state media outlets, diplomats, and government officials. So I will ask the panel to come join me on stage. We didn't pre-work out the seating arrangements, so I want to say that I did send them a list of about 65 plus questions. So we are not going to get to all of those, especially since I know all of you are going to have your own questions to ask. So we'll probably do, how much time do we have left in the, okay, so we'll probably do about 25 minutes or so of my questions, and then we'll turn it over to you all. So I'm going to start with sort of the the basic question, which I'll ask each of you. I'm sort of curious, we're talking about how our adversaries are influencing anti-Semitism in the United States, but obviously there's some anti-Semitism that is here in the United States already, right? Native anti-Semitism. So to start, how much of the anti-Semitism do you see is today sort of latent hatred newly expressed, and how much of it do you think is being, let's call it, imported by our adversaries? And maybe Behnam, I'll start with you because Iran is such a big player in this.
Sure, and thank you, Carrie, and distinguished panelists for sharing the stage with me. It's glad not to be a virtual stage. And Ludo, thank you for that very troubling tour de force of anti-Semitism and anti-Americanism. And there perhaps may be no better country where this nexus comes together than the Islamic Republic of Iran. And despite the somewhat changing face you may think Iran is putting on with purportedly a new president who is getting ready to be inaugurated this weekend, he actually had an op-ed that got to the heart of your question, Carrie, an op-ed that he wrote in English, in an English paper in Tehran recently, where he actually lauded the efforts of American university students. And cognizant of everything Ludo said about the need to combat anti-Semitism, he sought to disassociate everything we saw and everything we heard and everything that you find on social media and everything that some of you may have witnessed firsthand by looking at some of those campus protests as being merely anti-Zionism and not anti-Semitism. So it's a two-way street. Not only is the Islamic Republic able to amplify the existing currents and trends of anti-Semitism from whatever corners that they may exist in America, be it on the left or on the right, or perhaps entirely on the entire anti-establishment front, but moreover, it's cognizant of the changing discourse and recycles that back in. So it's cognizant of this new anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism debate. And it brings that back into its own discourse by its own political elites, and then recycles that back out again in social media, tweets, and whatnot.
I want to maybe direct the question a little bit differently, Emily, to you. Obviously, one of the sources of disinformation is social media, and TikTok in particular. We know that there's a Pew Research study that came out that said about 32% of Americans between the ages of 18 and 29 are regularly getting their news from TikTok. And I would also just remind the audience that it only took a few days after the terrorist attack of October 7th, as I mentioned in the opening, where all of a sudden there was this newfound interest in Osama bin Laden's letter to America, where he justified the killing of over 2,000 Americans on September 11th. So I guess how is it that the Chinese Communist Party sort of uses TikTok as a platform to spread its own propaganda, and how does that specifically relate to TikTok's use to promote anti-Semitism?
One of the things about China's propaganda, misinformation, and disinformation generally, and that also applies to this question, is that through platforms like TikTok, they have figured out a way to turn up the dial or amplify or target narratives that are already out there. And that makes their propaganda much more effective because it's genuine, because it doesn't have their fingerprints on it, and it is also better targeted, which I'll get to in a second. And TikTok is the perfect platform for this. You don't have to go out and write a propaganda piece in Global Times. You just make sure that the algorithm is favoring one narrative and disfavoring or just not capturing a different narrative. And also you can ensure with a platform like TikTok that the people who are most vulnerable are targeted. And I think that's really important in the kind of power China has today at spreading these kinds of narratives.
Is the most vulnerable in this instance like college students and
also people who are affiliated with more legitimate causes that might then become kind of crossovers. And I think we're entering an era where a lot of college students might say, if I associate with this cause, I by definition am also anti-Israel or anti-Semitic, and that's like a big risk as you have platforms like this that can kind of combine them.
And Brett, I do want to give you an opportunity to talk specifically about Hamilton 2.0, because I think it's a really interesting resource that many people may not be familiar with. But first, you've said that Russia's propaganda machine really sees an opportunity for self-promotion in the Israel-Hamas conflict and spreading anti-Semitism online. So how does the Kremlin view propaganda against Israel as a tool to promote its own interests and frankly, to bolster its own war effort in Ukraine?
Yeah, I like the sort of phrasing utilitarian anti-Semitism. I use opportunistic anti-Semitism. It's not really baked into the DNA of Russia in terms of its external messaging in the way it is with Iran. But in this case, it is so beneficial for them to promote these narratives because, one, it is the divisive topic of the day in the US, and that's just what Russia seizes upon, whether it's NFL protests, George Floyd. Russia doesn't care about the outcome of any of these debates. What they care about is seizing upon these debates to sort of insert themselves into conversations and kind of redirect the conversation in a way that's beneficial. So in this case, what they care about is Ukraine. So by linking the two issues together, one, it distracts from Ukraine, and two, it creates this problem for certain groups who, generally speaking, have been opposed to Russia's invasion and thinking kind of the progressive left here, where if you can kind of divide that audience and link those two issues together, it sort of moves support away from supporting Ukraine. So you've seen Russia, in this case, jump on some anti-Semitic narratives and tropes, not really because I think that that's kind of core to who they are, but because it's just beneficial. And when they look at advancing their own strategic objectives, which is eroding support, particularly among the left, for Ukraine, that's the vehicle to do it, because Russia's actions in Ukraine are just not popular. They're not popular in the US, they're not popular globally. Opposition to Israel, unfortunately, and anti-Semitism is popular globally. So they sort of jump on that train, but they're jumping on that train with a very clear goal that this is about Ukraine and it's about dividing audiences and eroding support.
One of the other sources of influence, in addition to the social media platforms, is, of course, the money. And we see this as it relates to both Iran and China, I think. So just as a little bit of context, between 2012 and 2014, nearly 200 US colleges and universities had established contracts with Chinese businesses that's a total of $2.32 billion. And a study from 2022 revealed that from 2001 to 2021, Qatar donated $4.7 billion to numerous academic institutions throughout the United States. Maybe we'll start again with Behnam. Why, in your perspective, and obviously Qatar and Iran are two different countries, but they are united as it relates to the support for Hamas. And so what is their interest in donating to these universities, and how do they leverage it for situations like this to benefit their own narrative?
Well, certainly countries like Qatar do have a benefit in endowing, whether it's Islamic studies departments, Middle East studies departments, political science departments, you name it. Qatar is not alone. There's a lot of work, unfortunately, when it comes to these countries that you could call frenemies, that have some kind of a U.S. alliance orientation and some kind of a China, Russia, third worldist, anti-America, anti-imperialist orientation as well. And they often hedge, and they use this to their advantage to seed narratives that actually in the long run end up pulling the plug, you could say, on US soft power as well as on the soft power of America's partners and allies in the region. So it creates space for narratives that you might be able to find on Al Jazeera, because it's instrumentally taken out the rear flank of someone who could be able to constitute a threat to it. That's Qatar. But on Iran, for example, the word I use is ornamental and instrumental. They look for areas to press their advantage, but it's also organic and endogenous to them. And I'm sure the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran wishes it could endow different universities and charitable trusts and whatnot. But there are countries, even like the UK, for example, where the Islamic Republic does have a freer hand. And while it may not be endowing, you could say, top-tier universities, it is endowing religious centers, cultural centers. There's an organization, it's their own university. It's called Al-Mustafa University, for example. It exists on several continents. It helps, basically spew hate speech in the actual language that the school is being taught in. So in Argentina, for example, the curriculum can be in Spanish as well as in Persian. They have obviously Arabic classes as well. They do this kind of stuff across Northern Europe. And the goal is to be able to bring their ideology into the local population and to create a least common denominator for their anti-Americanism and their anti-Semitism. And it's not that you have to be Persian, it's not that you have to be Arab, it's not that you have to be Middle Eastern, it's not that you have to be Shia, it's not that you have to be Muslim, but it is that you have to harbor this third worldist, rejectionist, anti-imperialist worldview. And from that filthy sore, to borrow from Tocqueville, everything else flows.
And Emily, in terms of China's use of finances to promote not only their worldview, but to also spread anti-Semitism, what are we seeing there?
Well, China's influence campaign is everywhere. And you start looking at universities, and then you get to subnational governments, then you get to companies, and then you get to national government systems. And there's a strategic level goal there, which is to undermine the agency and autonomy of the United States. But that also means that at any point when there's a tactical goal, in this case, spreading anti-Semitic narratives, you can, again, just really dial up that narrative or neutralize alternatives. China's adept at saying to a university, for example, if you espouse this, there goes your funding, or there go your students. What if China tells universities that it's probably not safe for their students to go to that school? That's a massive influence lever. And so I think China's very quick ability to say we have this positioning and we're going to use it for this current tactical goal is a really core part of what they're doing right now.
And then Brett, I'm very curious about Hamilton 2.0. I've taken a look at it. First, can you just kind of explain what it is to the audience, and then I'll have a couple follow-up questions about what we've learned from it.
Sure. So Hamilton sort of looks at the tip of the iceberg, or the propaganda iceberg. So this is everything that is overt that we can clearly attribute to one of those three governments. So this is every state media account that we can find on the platforms that we're actually able to collect data on. It's also all of their diplomatic accounts. So these are embassy accounts and government officials and their ambassadorial accounts. So it's about 1,500 accounts between the three countries. So these are all the sort of bat signal accounts. These are the sort of high profile ones. Clearly, they're doing things in the covert space too that we can't track in real time. But it gives us the ability to see, at least at the official level, what the sort of narrative interests are of the three countries at any given time, where they're trying to shift the conversation. It also allows us to do longitudinal research to see, okay, over a period of time, how often have they talked about neo-Nazis, for example, if you're talking about Russia? So it's really just a sort of research tool that gives us a pretty solid database to pull from, and also for journalists to cite. So instead of going to a journalist and saying, we've seen a couple posts from Russia pushing this idea that Ukrainian intelligence was behind the assassination attempt on Trump, which is currently a Russian narrative push, we have the database there to go and say, there's been 45 of these messages in the last 3 days. So on this topic, I looked before I came, and the total mentions of Zionism or Zionist over the past year from the three countries that we're talking about today. And so you have Iran that's mentioned at 45,000 times. Russia's a little bit below 1,000. China's 38. Now, that doesn't directly correlate, of course, to anti-Semitism, but there's a correlation there, generally speaking. So that's the purpose of the tool. It gives us a database that we can have really solid data points when we're writing our own reports, but also for journalists, for external researchers, so they can go to and actually pull up sort of hard, concrete data.
Has it given you a sense of how those three adversaries sort of message on this particular question differently or in different ways? How should we think about the nuances between these three countries and how they're using anti-Semitism, whether it's propaganda against Zionism or whatever the case may be?
China, on this topic, is very circumspect. They generally don't address the issue head on. Russia can kind of swing both ways. They're pretty malleable. I mean, the interesting thing about Russia, if you look at the audience that is drawn, I think, to Russian messaging in the US, it really does pull a little bit from the left and right. It is that kind of horseshoe left-right. They're kind of unique in the US ecosystem. If they actually do have a left and right audience, I don't think it's the left and right audience that we're looking for. I think when we're pushing, can't we just have more bipartisan news? But when you look then at Iran, Iran is very explicit and very overt in their anti-Semitism. You look at the guests that they bring on too. These are openly anti-Semitic people. There have been people who've been removed from university jobs because of being anti-Semitic. That's the kind of core audience for Iranian messaging. Russia samples from that collection of guest experts sometimes, and so they tiptoe on the edge of being overtly anti-Semitic. But again, it's not kind of core to what they do in the way that Iran leans hard into anti-Semitism.
Ben, you had testified before the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and you were calling attention to Russia and Iran's increasing support of one another's foreign and security policies. And per your testimony, you sort of you said a phrase that I think is very relevant to this conversation, which is you spoke about the salience of anti-Americanism as both a strategy and as an ideology. So what tools, we were just talking about how Iran is much more overt than some of these other nations. What's the sort of full spectrum of tools that they're using specifically to promote anti-Semitism and anti-Americanism? We mentioned the social media, we mentioned money. You also mentioned their sort of global influence campaigns. What else are they doing to try to change people's minds?
So for the Islamic Republic, you mentioned strategy and values there. There's another way one of my colleagues puts it, which is statecraft and soulcraft. Both Khamenei and Putin, these guys believe what they say. Now, there may be a different level of malleability or intentionality with the Russians, and it might be more context dependent. But for the entire governing elite of the Islamic Republic, these issues, anti-Americanism, anti-Semitism, anti-Israel, these are issues that for lack of a better word, founding fathers of the Islamic Republic, they cut their teeth on this issue. Just, for example, as Ayatollah Khomeini used to chastise the late Shah of Iran for being an American agent, he used to also use pejoratively, is the Shah an Israeli? Like, this was in his sermons before he was exiled from Iran. So this is in the zeitgeist of how Iran's revolutionary leaders speak. So it could be in something as simple as a press release, or something that I fear is much more complex, and that's actually war fighting, meaning outside the information domain. The big difference with the West and the rest, but in particular the West and Iran and its axis of resistance, that's the name for this constellation of terror and proxy forces, is that, as Ludo mentioned, their attacks as well carry a certain political message. Much like the attack over the weekend by the Iran-backed Houthi rebels using a modified Iranian drone struck for the first time during this conflict Tel Aviv late at night, early in the morning, killing one person and injuring two. So the Islamic Republic and its terror proxies are also using military means to convey political messages. Whether it's the names of some of these weapons, this drone, for example, was named the Yafa, for example. A Houthi medium-range ballistic missile that tried to strike Eilat after is named the Tufan. That's the Arabic and Persian word for storm. It's also, a copy-paste from Tufan al-Aqsa, the name of the October 7 terrorist operation. So it can be in something as simple as a munition name to the way these militias are integrating themselves more as part of a newfound way of war to literally act on that which they say, or it can be the same tried and true stuff that everyone here is mentioning, which is online or more informal vectors of influence like cultural centers, diplomatic facilities, and religious centers.
You mentioned earlier Al-Mustafa University, and I think it's a case that's really relevant for today, especially since one of the individuals who was in Argentina during the Amia bombing, a Hezbollah operative, is now very directly linked to Al-Mustafa University. So can you just give the audience a little bit of a sense of what that is and how it operates in other countries?
Yeah, actually, there's some really good reporting over the past, I think, half decade now on Al-Mustafa's activities in sub-Saharan Africa. And I never got around to writing this article, and I think there's a lot of distinguished Iran watchers in the audience. Maybe they could or should, or over time someone can make this into a book or a report. But in the Cold War, we had the missile gap between the US and the USSR. Really, there's been something of a minaret gap between the Islamic Republic of Iran and Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia has really ceased to kind of export or do its dawah, export its religious ideology this way. But when you look at the non-Arab Middle East, you look at South Asia, you look at Sub-Saharan Africa, you look at South America, this is where the Islamic Republic's kind of ecumenical rather than sectarian message is most important. And even though Al-Mustafa is getting people to the job of the Al-Mustafa staff is to get people to come out as, believers in Twelver Khomeinist Shiism. When you come in, the least common denominator that you need to come in is merely that anti-establishment, that anti-Western disposition that they can ride and move and convert. So whether it's South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, again, that's the most interesting space actually, or tried and true South America, this is part of that long arm.
I'm going to ask one more question, and it's the same question for all three of you, and then we'll go to the audience, which is, how effective are these countries being? I mean, when we look at, as the leader of the free world, American preeminence really presupposes not only military strength, but importantly, a sense of mission that we all believe that America is a force for good in the world, is constantly looking for self-repair. So how pernicious is what each of these countries doing, and how effective do you see their specific actions being? I'll just add to that question, which is, what can and should we be doing to try to counter the influence that they are having. So we'll start with Benham and then work our way down.
Okay. So
I always like to end my questions with like a 3-part essay length question. So go ahead.
do I have essay length time? Okay, I'll be.
How successful and what should we do about it?
So the interesting thing with the Islamic Republic, again, measure of these guys believe what they say. They believe their seeding of this intellectual terrain in the past 2-3 decades helped bring the world to this precipice. Now, that is quite a bit of hyperbole, but if you look at what they believe and what has happened, there is correlation, not causation. For example, late in his life, Ayatollah Khomeini wrote a letter to the head of the Soviet Union, inviting him to embrace Islam. And if that he didn't embrace Islam, the Soviet Union would collapse. The Soviet Union collapsed, and Iran's revolutionary elite saw this as a vindication of Khomeini's dawah. If you go back to, you mentioned campus protests, or we all mentioned campus protests, the Islamic Republic was eerily interested in the Wall Street protests in 2011 as the decline of the other element of the liberal international order, that this combination of corporatism and capitalism and what the West believes to be liberal democracy had sowed the seeds of its own demise. Every time the Iranian presidents in the past few years went to the UNGA, they took another one of our own self-inflicted wounds, whether it was the BLM movement or the January 6th stuff, and the Iranian presidents would tout this from virtually, or when they were back in UN post-COVID, from the lectern over there. So, if there is one thing I could advise us not to do, and, Brett, we kind of talked about this privately before we got here, is no own goals. No more own goals from the left to the right and from the right to the left. How we fight and how we adjudicate our domestic disputes and our civil disputes with one another, always remember America's authoritarian adversaries are watching. Whether that's Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, Syria, Venezuela, what have you, Cuba, they are all watching. So just remember, if you're trying to own the libs or own the Trumpkins or anything else in between, that this is something that is about to be used against you and your neighbor. So that's a very philosophical
I want to give you a
level.
standing ovation for that one because I really think that's 100% true. So thank you for that. We'll do it. We'll give you not standing, but a gentle, polite, seated ovation.
Golf clap.
Emily, what about how successful is China being, and what can we do to stop their influence?
I want to add a preface to the 3-part essay,
Yes.
which is relevant, backing up a couple things. We're talking about 3 different countries and their different approaches to this question. There's also the point that they're working together. And I think that's really important to underscore. Iran might be the very direct player, but it's getting support and fuel from China in the same way that Russia is. And they all have their different roles to play in a highly collaborative way, which just that one point to make. In terms of success, the first question is what at least is China trying to achieve? And one is spreading chaos and polarization in the U.S., so we can't do anything. One is self-loathing in the U.S. Can we make America hate itself? And the third is undermining the U.S.'s role on a global stage and undermining both U.S. alliances and non-alliances. Chaos seems pretty well achieved on this question, and there's no doubt that increased polarization on this issue has undermined U.S. effectiveness in both domestic and international policy. So I think success and growing success on that front. Self-loathing, I think obviously this is a trend that precedes the specific question rising to the fore and extends well beyond questions of anti-Semitism. But I don't think younger generations in America are particularly pro-America at present. And this is not helping. So success on that front from China's perspective. And I think a big thing to watch is the third question of how does the U.S. international posture evolve on this because of forces that are being stoked by our adversaries. And I think it's important there to look at both positive and negative U.S. relationships, including the U.S.-Israel relationship. That's a really important one. China at least sees Israel as a strategic asset. If China can use what it's doing domestically in the United States in terms of stoking anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism to drive a wedge between the U.S. and Israel and therefore bring Israel closer to China, that's a remarkable success from China's perspective.
Brett, over to you. And I would just add, it seems to me that Russian disinformation is one of the most prominent that comes across my screen, at least as it relates to not just anti-Semitism, but also the war in Ukraine. So how successful are they being, and what can we do to protect ourselves?
Yeah, on the impact question, I mean, I've been doing this now for 7 years, and every time I've been asked that question, I respond with, I don't know. I don't know how successful they are and how much of this would still be there if we somehow were able to wipe the Russians off of Twitter. So yes, all of those conditions definitely exist. I'm not sure they wouldn't exist even in the absence of Russian trolling operations. It's not an answer that my funders maybe like me to give, but I don't know.
We like the truth here at Vandenberg, so it's a fine answer.
But I kind of look at the role as less of, I mean, I use the term sowing division, but I also don't really like the term because I'm not sure they have been that successful. What I think they've been successful at, and we talked about this before the event, is using these divisive issues as sort of a gateway drug to bring people into the Russian information ecosystem. So most Americans have opinions about Biden or Trump. They have opinions about police brutality and race and racism and anti-Semitism and all of these things that Russia talks about. So Russia talks about those things because it attracts an audience. And once you're in the fold, then you get the Russian narratives about Ukraine and all of these issues that Russia does really care about that Americans in many cases don't have really firm, solidified opinions about. So when you're talking about Russia pushing this idea that Ukraine is behind the assassination attempt, how are Americans seeing that? Americans are seeing that because they've followed posts that deal with issues that Americans care about. And this isn't just sort of an abstract thing. When you're on social media and you like posts from Russian state media, you're going to see more of those posts. Russia knows this. They understand search engine optimization, and they understand all of these ways to attract an audience. So I look at a lot of these divisive issues as the way for Russia to get into the conversation, to kind of move the needle on issues they care about. And one other point, just kind of on the impact question, though, we tend to look at the US, but Russia's most successful outlets are those in Africa, Latin America, the Middle East. RT in Espanol outperforms RT by like 2-to-1 on every platform we watch. On Facebook, RT in Espanol outperforms CNN in Espanol, BBC Mundo, every other major international Spanish language broadcaster. So that's significant in terms of the anti-American question. What can we do about it? Unfortunately, when it's coming from authentic, genuine Americans, we have to sort of deal with a little bit of the lawful but awful speech. When it is coming from inauthentic accounts, when it's coming from Russian trolling accounts, if you have good trust and safety teams, you can take that down. This isn't a First Amendment issue. And then you also have to look at the advertising ecosystem online. If we get advertisers to care more about having ads placed on credible news outlets instead of programmatic ads that are sort of diffuse and spread across a lot of very sketchy outlets, some of which the Iranians and the Russians and the Chinese either back or in some ways have their information laundered through, that would go a long way, at least towards shrinking the sort of community of bad actors. I mean, Russian trolls are going to do what Russian trolls do, but those who are doing the sort of malign activity, spreading anti-Semitism for profit, you make it not profitable, fewer people get involved.
All right, we will now open it up to questions. So I will call on you, and they're going to get my microphone and bring it around. So just say who you are, and then ask your question. So we'll go over to this.
Hi, thank you so much for having this panel. My name is Deborah Weiss, and I'll do a question like yours. My question is on number one, can you comment on the role of how the media is portraying all this, the Hamas conflict, and how that's feeding into anti-Semitism? The second part would be the role that the Biden administration has played in terms of its position on Israel. In the past, we've had both sides of the aisle, presidents fully supporting Israel, but if you know anyone who lives there, works there, in the IDF, connections to the government, you know that early on, he told Americans he was supporting Israel, but behind the back, it's a completely different story, and how that might feed, how he's handling the conflict behind the scenes, how it's feeding into anti-Semitism. And the final thing is, would you care to, along that line, the trajectory of the Democrat Party and how they've changed over time recently from, it used to be Democrats and Republicans staunchly supported Israel, and I think it's clear that it's split on the left now, and would you care to either explain and or comment on how that came to be? That's my three-part question.
I can touch on the last one a little bit, and everyone has to buckle up here with truth telling, just telling it like it is. The JCPOA, the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, shattered 4 semi-critical, if not critical, consensuses across 4 different communities, and they all existed in the Iranian American community, Jewish American community in terms of diasporas, and then in terms of functional work that affects the way the U.S. government operates in this town, the sanctions community and the arms control and non-proliferation community. That is a massive cleavage that, in my view, as someone who is in at least 2 of them and straddles at least the other 2 socially friendly adjacent wise, I see that none of those communities have recovered from. It is a lightning rod that has caused friction. And while Iran's political leaders, military leaders, what have you, both before the deal, during the deal, after the deal, broad brush paint Americans as imperialists and Zionists and on all those lovely isms and its that they all like to use, in Iran's diplomatic strategy, believe it or not, they have a diplomatic ground game. It's not just the soft power of social media, it's actually what their officials do, and both the knife in the back and the handshake in the front, is I think they understand that there has been a change. And the willingness of at least one flank, both in Washington, as well as their kind of social class of supporters, to see the root cause as America's fault rather than the Islamic Republic's fault, and the willingness of that same social class, again, these are correlations, I'm not hurling accusations, just seeing trend lines, the willingness of that class to go above and beyond to atone for that America as the original sin primary mover, feeds into the desire for diplomacy at any cost, sanctions relief at any cost, pay to delay schemes with the Islamic Republic's terrorism, hostage-taking, nuclear program, what have you, such that 2018, 2019, Microsoft, Facebook, they are going after Iran-backed spoofing attempts that are trying to amplify voices on the American progressive left. That's the part I said buckle up in. Such that when they do the hacking for the 2020 election, they know enough about our left and right and about themes that were being used in the 2020 discourse that they used the Proud Boys issue to drive voting in the opposite direction. They knew who the Proud Boys would be spooked for and against to drive voting in the opposite direction. And that was ideally for them in a more left-leaning direction. It doesn't mean that the left is pro-Iran. It doesn't mean that the right is pro-Putin. But there is an understanding, again, because of the openness of our politics and how, again, we adjudicate those debates, that the adversary is watching and will try to ride that current. So at least on the third element of your question, the unfinished business of the JCPOA, the cacophony and the chaos that exists in those 4 communities towards coming up with a more coherent Iran policy has been strategically favoring the Islamic Republic, in my view. So it broke that. I don't like bipartisanship. I like non-partisanship. It should be objective fact. And once it ceased to be objective fact, we got to where we are.
Hi, thanks for doing this. I'm Jack Wolfson with Senator Blackburn's office. There was recently a report, as I'm sure you all know, from the Office of the DNI, talking about how Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, has taken advantage of the pro-Hamas protests on and encampments on college campuses to basically, I guess, instigate them, spread anti-Semitism, anti-Israel sentiment. Is there any, I assume some of this is classified, but is there any evidence that Iran has been coordinating with, Students for Justice in Palestine or some of these other pro-terrorism groups that exist on college campuses?
So I haven't seen it. By the way, we don't have to make this all Iran. If you want to fish for other questions, I'd be happy to. But
there's also a China.
Sure. Do you want to start with China and then I'll come in at the end? Do you want to?
And I can say the China next.
No.
Their funding streams, so you probably only
Yeah. So I was just going to say that there have been very clear funding streams with individuals connected with the CCP. So you've probably seen research on Neville Roy Singham, who is a CCP sort of affiliated operative who, when you look at a lot of these university protests, you saw that they were very coordinated, they were very sophisticated, they had incredible resources. And the question was, how did this happen so supposedly organically, within 5 days? And on certain universities, I think at Columbia, it was about 25% of people who were arrested weren't actually affiliated with the university. At other universities, it's been as high as 65, almost 70%. And so when they looked into who are these people and where is their funding coming from, this individual, Singham, was top among them. And so you do see the CCP relationship, I think, very, very deeply to the organization of these protests. And I'll turn it over to Benham for the Iran component.
Just briefly on Iran, this is something that needs to be in the brightest of bright lights from a congressional angle, because I do believe the vast majority of this stuff is classified, because the real nut graph in the DNI statement was the financial nexus, the material support nexus. And anyone who looks at sanctions or any of this other kind of stuff, that would be the I got you language. And the fact that we don't know who it was from in Iran, and we don't know who it was to, at least not reported yet, means that this is something, an area Congress needs to get involved in, to get this information out into the public, because the more speculation, the more problematic I think it's going to be for how, again, Americans adjudicate these debates, how literal kids on college campuses adjudicate these debates. So I think there's a huge role for Congress here to play. There needs to be hearings. I think there's organizations writing letters as we speak about this issue. There needs to be, classified briefings on this. You can't have the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism that's been talking about doing this for some time actually be able to inject resources into a domestic debate that is this big and let them get off scot-free.
Hi, my name is Nina Sadat. I work for Tikva. I want to thank you all for coming out here and speaking with us. There's a live debate in the Jewish community about the value of Holocaust education. There are people who believe that there's an absence of Holocaust education that creates the environment in which anti-Semitism can become so popular both here and overseas. And there's another narrative that Holocaust education promotes, first of all, it invites Holocaust denialism. It provides an opportunity to touch on that point, and also that it paints Jews as victims, where both here and especially overseas, people who ideologically favor the victor don't see Holocaust education as a story about human evil, but about military triumph or something more sinister even than that. Could you address the effectiveness of Holocaust education and its effect both here and overseas on narratives about the Jews?
I can't address effectiveness. What I can say is that I think what distinguishes the U.S. information environment and approach to knowledge narratives in general from those of the three countries we're talking about is that we favor education and talking about things. And that's an ideological point on my end, and it doesn't speak to what's the most effective thing, but I think it does speak to something that's good and different about the U.S. system.
I'll just say something briefly on this, because one of my main focuses is on trying to make sure that people sort of understand their context and understand what is facing them. And as it relates to Holocaust education, I think the issue is we need to teach, one, I think a lot of this starts in Jewish day schools and in synagogues and places like this, where a lot of Jewish individuals are not trained about, forget the history of the Holocaust, but the history of Israel, right? There needs to be a lot more Israel education so that people can effectively understand why it was created, the context in which it was created, how it operates, so that they can be more informed when they are actually confronted with some of these questions. Now, they've done a better job than the anti-Israel activists, because typically they do have a bit more context than those individuals, but it still isn't as deeply ingrained in them as we would like. I do think it's important that there is Holocaust education, if for no other reason than it was a critical moment in world history that reflects what humans are fully capable of both then and today. And so we need, I don't think it has been effective, but I think it needs to become effective. So that's the way that I would sort of push it is there needs to be a mechanism for giving people an understanding. And it's a complicated one that this was both a particular moment against a particular people, which needs to be understood, but that it could happen again. And we need to be sort of looking out for all of those things. One of the main things that not only Hitler, but other adversaries around the world have done is the very first step that they've taken is what we're seeing here, which is the undermining of the concept of truth, capital T, truth. The moment a population doesn't agree on what the facts of the case are, you cannot have civil discourse. And that, I think, is to the root of what everybody is saying. That is why Russia, China, and Iran are so dedicated on undermining our ability to actually source and filter information to see what's actually going on in the world. And so if that is one key thing that we have not learned from our Holocaust education. So it doesn't really answer your question, unfortunately, but I do think that's one lesson that we should be drawing from this. I'm gonna go for one more question just because I saw a gentleman over, well, I'll do both of you since you're next to each other, so it's unclear. So we'll do the very back first, and then we'll do coming up one.
Hi, Peter Pomerantsev, Johns Hopkins University. I want to sort of zero in on the question of TikTok a little bit more. So, Emily, you mentioned it very intriguingly. Sort of looking at some data that was sent out by Future Majority, the big Democratic super PAC, which sort of had groups that were on TikTok were, I mean, stunning figures, almost like 15, 20% more likely to blame Israel rather than Hamas for October 7th. Still not the majority of people, but twice more likely. Now that's a correlation, that's not a causation, but these are stunning figures. And I wonder what your working hypothesis is on that. Is that, you mentioned algorithmic manipulation. We've had some whistleblowers come through. Is that just who seem to suggest that? Is that just negligence on the part of the moderators at TikTok who are producing a flood of content that gets people to feel this way? But also in terms of mitigating this going forward, there's been very strong action by the House against TikTok, but there seems to be a risk that might be rolled back in the future. And what can we be doing to mitigate that risk?
No, I don't think it's a question of negligence. The genocide against the Uyghurs in Xinjiang does not often get discussed on TikTok. I think it's the same reason. There are narratives that are very deliberately amplified on TikTok, whether it's directly due to its Chinese ties or indirectly due to its Chinese ties because of the incentives to do so. I think probably much more directly. And there are narratives that get played down. And there's also, again, targeting of narratives, right? Calling on the algorithm that if this person is interested in these things, you should also send it these messages. And I think the degree to which this is tied to TikTok being a Chinese company is evident in the difference between TikTok internationally and its equivalent in China. In China, TikTok is purely about educational and patriotic content. And I think that speaks to the degree to which there is an algorithm that is being shaped by the Chinese Communist Party. What to do about it, there's an obvious answer, which is not to have TikTok or not to have a Chinese-owned TikTok in the United States. That's a great start. It doesn't end there. I think one of the things related to the question of Chinese influence over universities at the subnational level over companies, again, Beijing's tentacles are everywhere, and you can point to specific social media platforms the same way you can point to Confucius centers, or you can point to certain universities that get an outsized percentage of their funding from China. This is a question of China. It's not a question of any of those individual things. And that's where there has to be a resolve to effectively take China out of the system it's currently distorting.
Just one other quick note on that question. Peter, I mean, the problem with answering that question is we don't know because we don't have the data. and we can't get the data. And TikTok has made it almost impossible for academics and researchers to access enough of a comprehensive data set to be able to answer that question. And this is a problem across the board with the social media companies now. They've really drawn back on their data access. I mean, Twitter X has made it prohibitively expensive. Facebook, Meta is shutting down CrowdTangle, which is what we all use to get Instagram and Facebook data in August. So to answer all these questions, we need data, and the companies are making it harder and harder and harder for researchers to access that.
Well, thank you very much. I'm Julian Weiss, no relation, unfortunately. I work for the Coalition for Jewish Values, and I'm currently a fellow at the American Jewish Committee. My question is about how Russia and China might actually be anxious about the anti-Semitic narratives. You know, Russia has a Jewish population of 100,000 people. They've seen riots in Dagestan, which I'm sure, you know, is pretty anxious considering their history. You know, and in terms of China, on my own campus, I've seen this very weird combination of very religious Muslims and very secular kind of third worldist people sort of coalescing together around this cause. And I'm sure, you know, for the Chinese, they might be a little bit uncomfortable with the way Islam might connect with this, considering their state atheism. Has there been any public anxieties towards these issues by these countries? Or have they, you know, indicated in any way they have a clear delineation versus what Iran might want?
It's a great question. I mean, Russia has concerns with radical Islamic terrorism, obviously. I mean, we've seen it a couple times now in the past few months. And so if this sort of geopolitical situation were different, I think you could have seen Russia sort of leaning the other direction on this. And so I think they do have domestic concerns. I'm not sure I've heard them articulated, but it wouldn't be the first time Russia has sort of leaned in a certain direction without thinking about the potential blowbacks from the other side. So I know that's not a very satisfactory answer, but I have thought of that, of, you know, they have domestic concerns here that pushing sort of anti-Semitism, pushing in the direction of being on the side of Hezbollah, has consequences at home. And just one sort of final note, because it's going to be my last sort of time to get this in, talking about the overlap of the three countries. You know, we put out a report recently, and I know this is sort of shameless self-promotion here, on our information laundromat report to see where RT articles were appearing elsewhere online on Transparently. Iranian state media was one of the main places, and Al-Manar TV, so Hezbollah's mouthpiece, runs RT articles verbatim, which likely means there's a content sharing agreement between the two. So I think that's pretty significant when you think of the sort of colliding worldviews.
As does Chinese media, for the record. I haven't seen any concern from China on that question, and I think that the PRC or CCP approach tends to be that they have domestic matters under control, and what they're doing in terms of sowing polarization or hatred internationally is not going to get through their borders. And in fact, they have built an information technology system very specifically to do that.
Well, with that, thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you all for coming. I really can't think of a more appropriate time for us to have this conversation, not only on the 30th anniversary of the bombings, but also in light of the hyper-partisanship, the polarization, the sense that there's no truth anymore in the world that I think we're all kind of spiraling in right now. So this is a reminder that a lot of that is intentional from our adversaries, and to stay vigilant and do the best that we can in promoting civil discourse and the quest for truth. So thank you all so much for joining us. We hope to see you at future Vandenberg events going forward.